Pinehurst, Georgia, was a small town that liked to think of itself as a model of Southern charm. Its streets were lined with neat white clapboard houses, each with a porch that seemed designed for quiet evenings and friendly neighbors. Yet beneath the surface of politeness and civility, there were cracks, deep and jagged, that no amount of smiling faces or church socials could cover. The town's racial divide, though less overt than in decades past, was alive in the segregated neighborhoods, the schools, and especially in the unwritten rules of conduct that kept people in their place. Few embodied the unspoken tension of Pinehurst more than Officer Amanda Brookes. At 36, Amanda was a figure of authority, but her reputation painted her as much more than that. She was tall, with a sharp-featured face and an air of superiority that seemed to hang around her like a cloud. Amanda had served in the Pinehurst Police Department for over a decade, and her career was littered with accusations of misconduct, unlawful arrests, excessive force, and a long string of incidents disproportionately targeting black residents. These complaints rarely amounted to more than closed-door meetings and buried reports. Amanda, after all, had connections. Across town in the West Pine neighborhood, Marcus Hale lived in a modest one-story house with a small garden he tended on weekends. At 28, Marcus had become a quiet but powerful force in his community. After losing his father to police violence when he was a child, Marcus had devoted his life to creating opportunities for others to thrive. He ran a community center where he organized art programs, sports leagues, and mentorship initiatives for at-risk youth. Tall and broad-shouldered with a calm demeanor, Marcus was the type of person who listened more than he spoke. But when he did speak, people listened. That Friday afternoon was like any other summer day in Pinehurst. The sun blazed down, making the air thick and oppressive. Marcus was driving his Chevrolet Impala, a well-loved car he'd worked hard to keep in pristine condition. The soft strains of jazz played from the car's speakers, and he tapped his fingers lightly on the steering wheel as he headed to the community center. He'd spent the morning picking up supplies for a graffiti workshop he'd planned, a way to keep the kids engaged and out of trouble during the long summer days. As Marcus cruised down a quiet street, his rearview mirror filled with the sight of flashing blue lights, his stomach sank. He knew the routine. Pulling over to the side of the road, he turned off the engine and kept his hands on the steering wheel, visible and still. He watched as Officer Amanda Brookes stepped out of her patrol car. Her mirrored sunglasses hid her eyes, but her stride was all too familiar. Deliberate, heavy, and brimming with authority. "License and registration," she barked as she approached, her tone clipped and sharp. Marcus handed her the documents, moving slowly and carefully, aware of every movement. He'd been through stops like this before and knew the unspoken rules. Avoid sudden gestures, keep your voice calm, and never, under any circumstances, show anger. Amanda scanned the papers with an exaggerated slowness, her lips curling into a smirk as she looked back at Marcus. "This car yours?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. "Yes, ma'am. It's registered in my name," Marcus replied evenly. "A car like this? For someone like you?" she asked, her words cutting deeper than her tone suggested. Marcus took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. He didn't respond, but he felt his grip on the steering wheel tighten. Amanda, seeming to enjoy the tension, took her time walking around the car, inspecting it as if searching for something, anything, to justify what was quickly turning into harassment. "Step out of the vehicle," she ordered suddenly, her voice leaving no room for hesitation. Marcus complied, his hands raised slightly to show he was no threat. He stepped onto the hot pavement, the sun beating down on his back. Amanda wasted no time. With one swift motion, she shoved him against the hood of his car. The metal was scorching under the summer heat, and Marcus winced at the contact. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice measured but firm. Amanda leaned in closer, her face inches from his. "You resisting me, Hale?" she sneered, her words slow and deliberate, each one meant to provoke. Before Marcus could reply, Amanda's fist came down hard. The punch landed squarely on his cheek, the force of it sending him staggering sideways. The crowd that had begun to gather gasped in unison. People from nearby houses and shops were stepping out, their phones raised, recording what was unfolding. Marcus stood still for a moment, his hand touching the side of his face where the blow had landed. The sting of the punch burned, but what burned more was the humiliation. Years of pent-up frustration, anger, and pain surged through him like a tidal wave. He straightened up, his broad frame towering over Amanda. Before she could react, Marcus struck back. His fist moved with precision, connecting with Amanda's face in a blow that sent her reeling backward. She stumbled, her sunglasses flying off and landing on the ground. The crowd erupted, some shouting in shock, others cheering in defiance. Amanda scrambled to regain her footing, her face red with both anger and humiliation. She looked around, her eyes darting to the sea of phones pointed at her, capturing every second. For the first time in her career, she seemed unsure, unsteady. Marcus stood his ground but didn't advance. He raised his hands in a gesture that said, "I'm done being your victim, but I won't fight unless you force me." His breathing was heavy, his face a mask of defiance. In the distance, the sound of sirens grew louder. Backup was on the way, but the scene had already been set. Amanda, her pride wounded and her authority challenged, looked smaller than she had moments before. The crowd continued to record, their voices growing louder as the tension thickened. Marcus knew this moment would change everything, for better or worse. But for the first time in his life, he felt a strange, liberating sense of power. This wasn't just about him. This was about everyone who had ever been silenced, humiliated, or beaten down. As the sirens drew nearer, Marcus locked eyes with Amanda. For the first time, she looked away. The streets of Pinehurst, Georgia, bore a history as heavy as the summer air. The past lingered in the form of old monuments celebrating Confederate generals and segregated school buildings repurposed as community centers. The division between East and West Pine was more than geographic. It was a line drawn by decades of inequity, a silent agreement about where you belonged depending on the color of your skin. Marcus Hale understood that line all too well. Growing up in West Pine, he'd learned early on how to navigate a world where every step felt scrutinized. His father, Darnell Hale, had taught him the rules. Rules meant to keep him alive. Keep your hands visible. Speak respectfully, even when they don't deserve it. And whatever you do, don't let them think you're angry. Those words had been Darnell's shield against a system that saw him as a threat. But the shield had failed. Darnell's death when Marcus was 9 years old was the defining moment of his life. Walking home from his late shift at a warehouse, Darnell was stopped by police for matching a description. He never made it home. The trauma of that night was etched into Marcus's memory. The knock on the door, the sight of his mother collapsing to her knees, and the cold, detached language of the officer delivering the news. That loss could have consumed Marcus, but instead, it shaped him into a man of quiet determination. He found purpose in the community center, where he spent his days mentoring kids and creating safe spaces for them to grow. To Marcus, the center wasn't just a building. It was a lifeline, a chance to shield others from the pain he had endured. Amanda Brookes lived on the other side of that line, both physically and ideologically. Born into a family of law enforcement, she grew up idolizing her grandfather, a sheriff who was praised for his firm hand during the civil rights era. Her father, also a cop, often spoke of those days with a sense of nostalgia that Amanda absorbed without question. Becoming a police officer felt inevitable, a legacy she was proud to continue. But Amanda's version of policing was deeply flawed. Her record was filled with complaints from residents accusing her of excessive force and racial profiling. She dismissed these accusations as the grumblings of people who didn't respect authority. If they don't like it, they should follow the law, she would say, a mantra that shielded her from any real introspection. Amanda's aggressive tendencies weren't just professional, they seeped into her personal life as well. Her recent divorce had left her bitter and volatile, a simmering anger that she often unleashed on those she deemed inferior. When she spotted Marcus's Impala that afternoon, her frustration boiled over. To her, he was everything she resented. Confident, unbothered, and driving a car that, in her eyes, someone like him didn't deserve. By the time Amanda pulled Marcus over, her intentions were already shaped by prejudice. She wasn't looking for a legitimate reason to stop him. She was looking for control. The community of West Pine was no stranger to these encounters. Residents had grown used to seeing Amanda's patrol car rolling through their streets, a symbol of authority that offered little protection. But this time, something was different. As Marcus stood with his hands raised, Amanda's aggression escalated into physical violence, and the crowd began to gather. "Why are you doing this?" a voice shouted from the growing group of onlookers. The slap of Amanda's fist against Marcus's face silenced the murmurs for a moment, replaced by a collective gasp. Marcus's punch in return, swift, powerful, and deliberate, was met with an eruption of voices. Some cheered, others screamed warnings, but all eyes remained fixed on the scene unfolding before them. Amanda stumbled backward, her sunglasses skidding across the pavement. Her face, usually a mask of authority, now showed a mixture of shock and humiliation. She wasn't used to being challenged, least of all by someone like Marcus. Phones were raised, capturing every detail of the confrontation. By the time Amanda regained her footing, the distant sound of sirens was growing louder. Backup was on the way, but the situation had already spiraled beyond Amanda's control. "He assaulted me," Amanda yelled, pointing at Marcus, her voice cracking under the weight of her anger. "You hit me first," Marcus replied, his tone steady but loud enough for everyone to hear. The backup officers arrived to find a scene they weren't prepared for. Amanda's authority, usually unquestioned, was now under scrutiny from a crowd that had witnessed everything. People were shouting, some demanding that Amanda be held accountable, others simply recording the chaos. Among the officers who arrived was Sergeant James Carter, a veteran with 25 years on the force. He had seen enough to know when a situation was irreparable. Stepping out of his patrol car, he assessed the scene quickly. Amanda's flushed face, Marcus's calm defiance, and the crowd's growing anger. "Everybody back up," Carter barked, raising his hands to calm the crowd. "Sergeant, Amanda began, but Carter silenced her with a look. "Not now, Brookes," he said, his voice low but firm. Turning to Marcus, Carter spoke evenly. "Sir, I need you to lower your hands and step over here." Marcus complied, his movements slow and deliberate. He wasn't afraid, but he understood the weight of the moment. Every step he took was being recorded. Every word he spoke would be analyzed. The crowd began to chant, their voices rising in unison. "We saw it. We saw it." Amanda's face darkened as the realization sank in. This wasn't going to end quietly. As sirens grew louder, and the crowd thickened around the unfolding scene, the tension was palpable, the air crackling with a mixture of anger and anticipation. Marcus stood near his Impala, his hands now lowered but still in plain view. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Amanda's flushed face and rigid posture, a picture of humiliation barely concealed by her badge. Sergeant Carter, standing between them, was a man caught in a storm he didn't want to navigate. His years on the force had taught him to read situations quickly, and this one was spiraling into dangerous territory. The phones, the chants, the raw anger in the crowd. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark. "Everyone take a step back," Carter shouted again, his voice carrying the weight of authority. Some in the crowd complied, but many stayed rooted in place, their phones still trained on the scene. Amanda, still clutching her face where Marcus had struck her, turned to Carter. "Sergeant, he assaulted an officer," she spat, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and desperation. Carter glanced at Marcus, then at Amanda. "And the crowd says you struck first. We'll sort this out back at the station," he said, his tone neutral but firm. Marcus exhaled slowly, his eyes scanning the crowd. He saw familiar faces, parents whose kids he mentored, neighbors he greeted every morning. Their expressions ranged from worry to solidarity. A woman in the front of the crowd holding a toddler on her hip spoke up. "We saw what happened. She hit him first." Her words ignited the crowd again, and chants of "Justice for Marcus" rippled through the air. Carter raised his hands again, trying to maintain control. "We'll handle this properly, but I need everyone to calm down." Amanda, ignoring Carter, turned back to Marcus. "You think you can get away with this?" she sneered, taking a step closer. Marcus met her gaze steadily. "I think it's time someone stood up to you," he said, his voice even but powerful enough to be heard over the murmurs. The crowd erupted into cheers and shouts, but Carter's patience was wearing thin. He motioned for two officers to escort Amanda back to her patrol car. "Officer Brookes, you're done here," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Amanda glared at him but complied, her pride wounded even further by the order. As she walked away, her presence still cast a long shadow over the scene. Turning to Marcus, Carter sighed. "Sir, I need you to come with us." Marcus nodded. "I'm not resisting," he said, raising his hand slightly in a gesture of compliance. "Good," Carter replied. "We're going to sort this out at the station." Marcus nodded silently, walking toward the squad car with measured steps. The crowd parted to let him pass, but their voices didn't quiet. "We're with you, Marcus!" someone shouted, and others echoed the sentiment. The solidarity of the community gave Marcus a strange sense of calm amid the chaos. He knew the gravity of the moment, how easily this could spiral out of his control, but he also felt the weight of something bigger. This wasn't just about him, it was about all the people who had been silenced before him. As Marcus climbed into the back of the squad car, he caught sight of Amanda sitting in another vehicle nearby, her jaw tight with fury. Even from a distance, he could see the humiliation burning in her eyes. For someone like Amanda, being challenged and losing was intolerable. Inside the police station, the atmosphere was tense. Sergeant Carter had already sent Amanda to another room, ensuring she couldn't escalate the situation further. Marcus was seated in a small interview room, his hands resting calmly on the table. "You want some water?" Carter asked, stepping into the room with a notepad in hand. Marcus shook his head. "No, thank you." Carter pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. "Look, I'm going to be honest with you. This isn't going to be easy. You hit an officer, and regardless of the circumstances, that's going to complicate things." "She hit me first," Marcus replied firmly. "There are videos, witnesses. I didn't want any of this to happen, but I wasn't going to let her treat me like that." Carter nodded slowly. "I've seen the footage. It's messy. But the law doesn't care about messy. It cares about what we can prove in court." "What about accountability?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but sharp. "You've seen what she's done in this town. How many complaints have been buried because no one wants to challenge her?" Carter sighed deeply, leaning back in his chair. "More than I'd like to admit," he said. His admission surprised Marcus. "But this is different. People saw it, they recorded it. This time there's no sweeping it under the rug." As Carter spoke, Amanda was pacing in another room, her frustration mounting. She could feel the tide turning against her, and the idea of facing consequences was foreign and infuriating. She had spent years building her reputation as an untouchable enforcer of the law, and now, a single punch had shattered that illusion. By the time Amanda was called in for questioning, the station had become a hotbed of activity. Officers whispered among themselves, glancing at the monitors where social media feeds displayed clips of the confrontation. The videos had gone viral, and the entire town, and beyond, was watching. Amanda sat stiffly across from Carter in the interrogation room, her jaw clenched. "Officer Brookes," Carter began, his tone professional but firm, "you know we have to address this properly. The footage clearly shows you struck Marcus Hale first." "He was resisting," Amanda snapped. "I did what I had to do to maintain control of the situation." Carter shook his head. "The video tells a different story, and we've got statements from witnesses backing it up." Amanda's face flushed with anger. "Are you seriously taking his side over mine? I've been on this force for years, Carter." "This isn't about sides," Carter replied evenly. "It's about doing what's right. You crossed a line, Amanda, and now we have to deal with the fallout." As the day turned into evening, news crews began gathering outside the station. The footage of Amanda hitting Marcus, followed by his measured but powerful response, had sparked a national conversation. People debated everything, from the abuse of authority to the courage it took for Marcus to stand up for himself. Inside the station, Marcus sat quietly as his lawyer, a sharp and determined woman named Cynthia Bell, arrived to advocate for him. Cynthia was well known for her work in civil rights cases, and she had taken an immediate interest in Marcus's situation. "Marcus, I've seen the footage," Cynthia said, her voice steady and reassuring. "We have a strong case, but we need to be smart about how we handle this. The public is on your side right now, but the system isn't." "I understand," Marcus said. "I just want the truth to come out." "It will," Cynthia assured him. "But you need to stay calm and let me handle the legal side. No more statements without me present, okay?" Meanwhile, Amanda's superiors held a private meeting to discuss the escalating situation. Pressure was mounting from both the community and higher-ups in the department to take action. By the end of the meeting, a decision had been made. Amanda would be placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. The news hit Amanda like a blow. As she walked out of the station, escorted by an officer, the crowd outside erupted into cheers. For them, it was a small but significant victory, a sign that, for once, accountability might prevail. Marcus watched from a side window, his emotions a mixture of relief and exhaustion. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but it was a step forward. That night, as Marcus returned home, he found his street lined with neighbors holding candles in solidarity. They greeted him with nods and words of support, and for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt the strength of his community surrounding him. The days following the incident in Pinehurst were anything but ordinary. The video of Amanda striking Marcus, followed by his precise and measured retaliation, had spread across social media like wildfire. News outlets picked up the story, turning Marcus and Amanda into unwilling national figures in a debate about police brutality, systemic racism, and accountability. For Marcus, the attention was overwhelming. Overnight, his quiet life as a community leader was replaced with a whirlwind of media interviews, protests, and legal preparations. The community center became a hub for organizing rallies, and volunteers flooded in, eager to support Marcus and the message his actions had come to represent. "Marcus," Cynthia said during one of their strategy meetings, "this case is bigger than you now. You've become a symbol, whether you wanted to or not. That's a lot of weight to carry, but it also gives us leverage." Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhaustion etched on his face. "I didn't ask for any of this," he said quietly. "I just wanted to stand up for myself." "And you did," Cynthia replied firmly. "But now you have the chance to stand up for everyone else too." As Marcus wrestled with his newfound role, Amanda was fighting a battle of her own. Isolated and humiliated, she found herself the target of intense scrutiny. News anchors dissected her record, revealing years of complaints that had been dismissed or ignored. Former colleagues came forward anonymously, describing Amanda's temper and questionable conduct. At home, Amanda's life was unraveling. Her divorce had already left her feeling bitter and alone, and now her reputation, something she had clung to with pride, was crumbling. She spent her days pacing her small living room, the glow of the TV illuminating headlines about the investigation. "They don't know what it's like," Amanda muttered to herself, gripping the remote tightly. "I was just doing my job." But deep down, a part of her knew the truth. The footage didn't lie, and neither did the witnesses. She had let her anger, her prejudice, and her sense of superiority dictate her actions. And now she was paying the price. Meanwhile, the tension in Pinehurst was reaching a boiling point. Protests erupted across the town, with signs demanding justice for Marcus and accountability for Amanda. The Pinehurst Police Department found itself under the microscope, with state officials announcing a full investigation into its practices. Among the protesters was Gloria, a high school teacher and longtime resident of Pinehurst. Gloria had known Marcus since he was a child, and often volunteered at the community center. She became one of the most vocal advocates for change, speaking at rallies and organizing petitions. "This isn't just about Marcus," Gloria said during a town hall meeting. "This is about every single person who's been silenced, who's been ignored, who's been hurt by a system that's supposed to protect us." But not everyone in Pinehurst was on Marcus's side. A small but vocal group of residents, led by Amanda's staunch supporters, argued that Marcus's actions were unjustified. They held counter-protests, claiming that Amanda was being unfairly vilified. "Amanda's been a loyal officer for years," said Tom Bryant, a local business owner and longtime family friend of Amanda's. "This is just another example of the media blowing things out of proportion and turning a good cop into a villain." These divisions spilled over into everyday life, straining relationships and igniting heated debates in schools, workplaces, and even churches. Families found themselves divided over the incident, with some rallying behind Marcus and others clinging to a narrative of law and order that shielded Amanda from accountability. At the center of it all, Marcus tried to maintain his focus. The community center became his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the noise and pour his energy into something positive. He expanded the programs, organizing discussions about racial justice and inviting speakers from other towns to share their experiences. One evening, as Marcus was locking up the center, he was approached by a teenager named Jamal. The boy had been a regular at the graffiti workshops and had looked up to Marcus for years. "Hey, Mr. Hale," Jamal said hesitantly. "Hey, Jamal. Everything okay?" Marcus asked, noticing the boy's nervousness. Jamal hesitated before speaking. I wanted to say thanks for standing up for all of us." Marcus smiled, placing a hand on Jamal's shoulder. I didn't do it for thanks, Jamal, but I appreciate it. And I want you to remember something. This fight isn't just mine. It's yours too. You've got a voice, use it. Jamal nodded, his confidence bolstered by Marcus's words. As Marcus inspired the next generation, Amanda faced a different kind of reckoning. Her suspension had left her with too much time to think, and for the first time, she began to question the choices that had brought her to this point. Late one night, Amanda sat at her kitchen table, staring at a photo of her father in his police uniform. She had idolized him as a child, but now the stories he used to tell felt hollow. Had she become the very thing she once promised herself she'd never be? The days turned into weeks, and the national spotlight only grew brighter. A court date was set, and both Marcus and Amanda prepared for the next phase of the battle. For Marcus, it was about more than clearing his name. It was about proving that change was possible, even in a town as resistant as Pinehurst. For Amanda, it was a chance to salvage what little remained of her dignity. But as the trial approached, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a legal battle. It was a confrontation with herself and the truth she had long avoided. The courtroom was packed on the day the trial began. Pinehurst had never seen such a spectacle. Residents, activists, reporters, and a sea of cameras crowded the small courthouse, eager to witness what many called a landmark case. On one side sat Marcus Hale, his quiet strength a stark contrast to the storm swirling around him. On the other, Amanda Brookes, her once intimidating demeanor now overshadowed by the weight of her actions. Judge Ellen Whitaker, a woman known for her no-nonsense approach, presided over the proceedings. She was deliberate in her actions, determined to ensure the trial didn't devolve into a media circus. "This court will maintain order," she said firmly at the start of the hearing, her gaze sweeping the crowded room. "This case isn't just about what happened between two people. It's about the law and how it is applied. We will respect that." The first days of testimony focused on the incident itself. Videos were played, showing Amanda striking Marcus and his measured but powerful response. Witnesses were called, including the woman with the toddler who had shouted at the scene. "She hit him first," the woman testified. "We all saw it, and he didn't fight back until she gave him no choice." Cynthia Bell, Marcus's lawyer, built a compelling case. She highlighted Amanda's history, presenting records of complaints filed against her over the years. "This wasn't an isolated incident," Cynthia argued. "It was part of a pattern, a misuse of authority fueled by prejudice." When it was Amanda's turn to testify, her lawyer tried to portray her as a dedicated officer under immense pressure. But the prosecution's cross-examination was damning. "Officer Brookes," the prosecutor began, "can you explain why you felt it was necessary to strike Mr. Hale, a man who was complying with your orders and posed no visible threat?" Amanda hesitated, her composure slipping. He was resisting," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Resisting how?" the prosecutor pressed. Amanda faltered. His presence was threatening." The room buzzed with murmurs, and the judge banged her gavel for silence. The turning point came on the fourth day of the trial. A surprise witness was called to the stand, Sergeant James Carter. His testimony would prove to be a bombshell. "Sergeant Carter," the prosecutor began, "you were the senior officer on the scene that day. Can you tell the court what you observed?" Carter cleared his throat, his voice steady but tinged with unease. "I saw Officer Brookes strike Mr. Hale first. It was unprovoked." "And what did you do after witnessing this?" "I ordered her to stand down and called for additional support," Carter replied. The courtroom was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Amanda stared at Carter, her face a mask of betrayal. "Why didn't you intervene sooner?" the prosecutor asked. Carter hesitated, then said, "Because I've seen what happens when officers speak out against their own, but I couldn't stay silent anymore." His admission sent shockwaves through the courtroom and the town. It wasn't just a condemnation of Amanda. It was an indictment of the entire system that had protected her for so long. For Marcus, Carter's testimony was a vindication, but it was also bittersweet. It reminded him of how many people had stayed silent in the face of injustice, only speaking out when it became unavoidable. Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere was electric. Protests grew louder, with signs demanding broader reforms. News outlets ran headlines like, "Sergeant breaks blue wall of silence," and Pinehurst reckons with systemic injustice. But the trial wasn't over. Cynthia had one final piece of evidence to present. She played a video recorded by a bystander after Marcus had been taken into custody. The footage showed Amanda pacing near her patrol car, unaware that she was being recorded. "He thinks he can humiliate me?" Amanda said, her voice sharp and angry. "I'll make sure he regrets this. No one gets away with challenging me." The courtroom erupted, the damning footage solidifying Amanda's intent. In the days that followed, the jury deliberated. Tensions in Pinehurst reached a fever pitch. Marcus avoided the public eye, spending his time at the community center and preparing for whatever came next. Amanda, meanwhile, retreated into herself, her defiance giving way to desperation. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom was packed once again. The jury found Amanda guilty of misconduct, excessive force, and perjury. The decision was celebrated by Marcus's supporters and marked a pivotal moment for the town. For Marcus, the victory was about more than clearing his name. It was a step toward accountability, a sign that change, however small, was possible. But as he left the courthouse that day, he knew the fight wasn't over. Pinehurst still had a long way to go. The courthouse steps were a sea of people when Marcus emerged after the verdict was announced. Cheers erupted, and the crowd surged forward, many holding signs that read, "Justice for Marcus" and "No more silence." He raised a hand to acknowledge their support, but his expression remained measured. The weight of the day hadn't fully lifted. It wasn't just about the trial, but the larger fight it represented. As Marcus walked toward the podium set up for his lawyer's statement, he caught sight of Gloria near the front of the crowd. She waved, her face beaming with pride. Nearby, Jamal stood with a group of teenagers from the community center, their eyes bright with inspiration. Cynthia Bell stepped forward first, addressing the cameras and reporters. Today's verdict is a step forward, not just for Marcus Hale, but for every individual who has been mistreated by the system. However, this is not the end. Justice is not a single moment. It's a process, and we have much work to do. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he hesitated for a moment, scanning the crowd. "This isn't just about me," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This is about all of us, about a system that has to change. I didn't want to be here, I didn't ask for this fight, but I couldn't stay silent, and I hope no one else will either." The crowd erupted into applause, their voices a collective roar of agreement. But as Marcus stepped away from the podium, he knew the challenges ahead would only grow. The trial might have ended, but the deeper problems in Pinehurst, and beyond, remained. Meanwhile, Amanda sat in her dimly lit apartment, the curtains drawn tight to keep out the world. The verdict had hit her hard, but what stung more was the realization that she had no one to blame but herself. Her phone buzzed incessantly with messages and calls, some from reporters, others from former colleagues offering half-hearted sympathy. One call, however, came from someone she hadn't expected, her ex-husband, David. "I saw the news," he said when she answered, his voice careful. "What do you want, David?" Amanda snapped, her walls going up instinctively. "I just thought maybe you could use someone to talk to," he replied. Amanda hesitated. She didn't want pity, especially not from him, but the loneliness had grown unbearable, and for once she didn't have the energy to push him away. "I don't need your help," she said finally, but her voice lacked conviction. David sighed. "Okay, but if you change your mind, I'm here." As the days passed, Amanda's isolation deepened. The police department's official statement announced her termination, citing her misconduct as unacceptable and inconsistent with the values of our organization. It was a bitter pill to swallow, especially knowing that many of her colleagues shared her views but had simply been smarter about hiding them. For Marcus, life took on a new rhythm. The community center became busier than ever, with people coming from neighboring towns to see the man who had stood up and won. But Marcus didn't let the attention distract him from his work. He continued mentoring kids, organizing events, and using the platform he'd gained to advocate for meaningful change. One evening, Jamal approached him after a basketball game at the center. "Mr. Hale," Jamal began, fidgeting with the strap of his backpack. "Yeah, Jamal?" Marcus replied, wiping sweat from his brow. "I was thinking maybe I could help out here, like volunteer or something," Jamal said, his voice tentative but hopeful. Marcus smiled. "We could use the help," And it's about time you started giving back, huh? Jamal grinned, the tension leaving his shoulders. Yeah, I guess it is. While Marcus worked to build something positive, Pinehurst as a whole remained divided. The trial had forced the town to confront its deep-seated issues, but not everyone was ready for change. Town hall meetings became battlegrounds, with heated debates over police reform, racial equity, and the town's future. One particularly tense meeting ended with Gloria delivering a fiery speech. "We cannot keep pretending this isn't happening," she shouted, her voice trembling with emotion. "If you're more upset about Officer Brookes losing her job than you are about what she did, then you're part of the problem." Her words were met with a mix of applause and angry murmurs, but Gloria didn't back down. Amanda, however, watched these developments from the sidelines. With no job and no allies left in Pinehurst, she decided to leave the town she had once thought of as her kingdom. Packing her belongings into a small U-Haul, she drove away in the dead of night, leaving behind a legacy of resentment and regret. The media eventually moved on, their focus shifting to the next scandal or story. But for Pinehurst, the ripples of the trial remained. The police department announced new training programs and a citizen oversight board, small but significant steps toward accountability. As Marcus stood in the community center one evening, watching a group of kids paint a mural, he felt a rare sense of peace. The mural depicted scenes of hope and unity, with the words, "Our voices matter," painted boldly across the top. Gloria walked up beside him, arms crossed as she surveyed the work. "Looks good, doesn't it?" she said. "It does," Marcus replied. "But we've got a lot more to do." Gloria nodded. "We always will. But for now, this is a start." Months after the trial, life in Pinehurst began to settle into a new normal. But for Marcus Hale, nothing would ever be the same. The community center had become more than a safe haven. It was now a symbol of resilience and progress. Donations poured in, allowing Marcus to expand the programs he'd dreamed of offering for years. College prep workshops, job training, and even therapy sessions for those dealing with trauma. Marcus, however, remained humble despite the attention. He spent his days working alongside the people he served, painting walls, setting up equipment, and mentoring kids who saw him as more than just a leader. For many, Marcus was a reminder that change wasn't just possible, it was inevitable when enough people stood together. One evening, Marcus found himself speaking at a town hall meeting, organized by Gloria. The room was packed with residents eager to hear his vision for Pinehurst. "We've made progress," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "But we can't stop here. It's not enough to fix what's broken. We have to build something better. That means holding each other accountable, supporting our kids, and making sure everyone in this town feels like they belong." The crowd erupted in applause, and Marcus felt a wave of pride. But beneath the surface, he knew the road ahead would be long. For every step forward, there were those who resisted change, clinging to the old ways with an iron grip. Amanda Brookes was one of those people struggling to find her footing in the aftermath. After leaving Pinehurst, she moved to a small town in northern Alabama, where she took a job as a security guard at a warehouse. The position was a far cry from her days as an officer, and every shift felt like a reminder of how far she'd fallen. In her tiny apartment, Amanda spent her evenings scrolling through social media, watching as Pinehurst moved on without her. News of Marcus's initiatives and the town's incremental reforms reached her, stirring a complicated mix of emotions. Part of her resented him, seeing him as the catalyst for her downfall. But another part, one she rarely acknowledged, felt a pang of regret. One night, Amanda found herself searching for videos of the trial. She watched herself on the stand, her voice defensive and brittle. Then she watched Marcus speak, his words measured and full of purpose. For the first time, she saw the stark contrast between them, not just in their actions but in their character. The realization was sobering. Amanda had always prided herself on being strong, but her strength had been rooted in fear and control. Marcus's strength, on the other hand, came from compassion and conviction. As the months passed, Amanda began to take small steps towards self-reflection. She started seeing a therapist, an older black woman named Dr. Yvonne Harris, whose no-nonsense approach left Amanda with nowhere to hide. "You've spent your life running from your own fear," Dr. Harris said during one session. "You've built walls so high that you can't even see who you've become." Amanda bristled at the comment but knew it was true. Slowly, she began to unpack the anger and prejudice that had fueled her actions. It wasn't an easy process, and the progress was often 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But for the first time in years, Amanda felt like she was moving towards something better. Back in Pinehurst, Marcus was grappling with his own growth. Despite the progress he'd made, the pressure of being a public figure weighed on him. He missed the days when he could simply focus on the kids at the community center without the constant scrutiny of cameras and reporters. One evening, Marcus received a visit from Gloria, who had become both a mentor and a confidant. She found him sitting on the steps of the center, staring at the mural the kids had painted months earlier. "You look tired," Gloria said, sitting down beside him. "I am," Marcus admitted. "Sometimes it feels like no matter how much we do, it's never enough." Gloria placed a hand on his shoulder. "That's because the work never ends, but that doesn't mean it's not worth doing." Marcus nodded, letting her words sink in. I don't want to let anyone down." "You won't," Gloria said firmly. "Because you're not doing this alone, and you don't have to carry it all on your shoulders." Her words stayed with Marcus, reminding him that change was a collective effort. He began delegating more responsibilities at the center, empowering others to take on leadership roles. It was a lesson in trust and vulnerability, but it paid off. The center thrived, and Marcus found himself with more time to focus on his own well-being. In Alabama, Amanda's journey was also gaining momentum. Through therapy, she began volunteering at a local youth center, working with kids from underserved communities. It was an unfamiliar and humbling experience, but one that forced her to confront her own biases and assumptions. One afternoon, while helping a teenager with a college application, Amanda felt a flicker of something she hadn't experienced in years: purpose. It wasn't the kind of power she had once sought as a police officer. It was quieter, rooted in service rather than authority. By the end of the year, Pinehurst was a town transformed. The police department had undergone significant changes, including new leadership and increased community oversight. The division between East and West Pine was still visible, but bridges were being built, both figuratively and literally. For Marcus, the journey was far from over, but as he stood outside the community center one evening, watching the kids play basketball, he felt a rare sense of peace. The fight for justice would continue, but so would the hope for something better. The evening air in Pinehurst carried a sense of anticipation as the town prepared for a major event, a community forum, at the newly renovated Marcus Hale Community Center. The forum was organized as a culmination of months of dialogue, activism, and reform efforts, a space for residents to voice concerns, propose solutions, and confront the lingering divides in the town. Marcus stood outside the center, greeting attendees as they arrived. The mural on the building's exterior, now completed with vibrant depictions of unity and hope, served as a beacon for what the town was striving to become. Yet, as Marcus welcomed each guest, he couldn't shake a feeling of unease. "Big night," Gloria said as she approached him, a clipboard in hand. "How are you holding up?" "Good, I think," Marcus replied, though his voice lacked confidence. "It's just, I don't want this to turn into another shouting match," Gloria smiled. "That's why we're here, to keep things productive. And you're the reason people are showing up in the first place. Don't forget that." Inside the community center, the seats filled quickly. Among the attendees were familiar faces, parents from West Pine, activists who had marched alongside Marcus, and even Sergeant Carter, who had retired after the trial but remained an advocate for reform. The forum also drew those who had been critical of the changes, including a contingent led by Tom Bryant, who still believed the police force had been unfairly targeted. As the forum began, Marcus took the stage to address the crowd. His words were measured, his tone steady. "This isn't about assigning blame," he said. "It's about moving forward. Pinehurst can't thrive if we're divided. We need to listen to each other, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable." The audience erupted into applause, but the energy shifted as the microphone was passed to others. Some spoke passionately about the progress that had been made, while others expressed frustration at the pace of change. "I've lived here my whole life," one woman said, "and I've seen more progress in the past year than in the last 50. But it's not enough. We need to do more." Tom Bryant, sitting near the back, finally stood up and took the microphone. "I think we've done too much," he began, his voice tinged with resentment. We've bent over backward for people who don't respect the law. What about the officers who've been vilified? What about Amanda Brookes? The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Marcus stood, his gaze steady as he addressed Tom directly. This isn't about vilifying anyone, he said. It's about accountability. If we can't hold ourselves to a higher standard, how can we expect this community to trust us? Tom scoffed but didn't respond, passing the microphone to the next speaker. As the forum continued, a figure lingered near the back of the room, unnoticed by most. Amanda Brookes had returned to Pinehurst. Dressed inconspicuously, she sat quietly, listening to the discussions unfold. Her presence was a risk. She knew she wouldn't be welcomed with open arms, but something had compelled her to come. Amanda had spent months reflecting on her actions and the damage she'd caused. Therapy had given her tools to confront her biases and begin the hard work of rebuilding herself. But part of that process required facing her past. When the microphone made its way back to the stage, Amanda stood, drawing audible gasps from the crowd. The room buzzed with whispers and murmurs as she walked toward the front, her movements deliberate but tense. Marcus's eyes widened in surprise, but he quickly composed himself. As Amanda reached the stage, she hesitated before taking the microphone. "I know I'm the last person you expected to see here," Amanda began, her voice steady but low. "And I don't blame you if you don't want to hear what I have to say, but I came here tonight because I needed to apologize." The murmurs grew louder, but Marcus raised a hand, signaling for silence. Amanda continued, "I've spent a lot of time thinking about what I did, what I've done over the years. I was wrong. I abused my authority. I hurt people who didn't deserve it. And for that, I am deeply sorry." Her words hung in the air, met with stunned silence. "I don't expect forgiveness," Amanda added, her voice cracking slightly. "But I do want to be better, and I want to be part of the change if you'll let me." The room erupted into a mixture of applause and skeptical murmurs. Marcus, still standing at the edge of the stage, stepped forward. "Thank you for coming," he said simply, his tone careful. "Change starts with accountability, and accountability starts with honesty. That's a good first step." Amanda nodded, her eyes meeting his briefly before she stepped down and returned to her seat. As the forum concluded, the atmosphere was charged with emotion. For some, Amanda's appearance was a sign of progress. For others, it reopened old wounds. But for Marcus, it marked a turning point, a moment when even those who had caused harm began to acknowledge the need for change. Outside the community center, Marcus stood alone, staring at the mural under the dim glow of the streetlights. The words, "Our voices matter," seemed to take on new meaning in the wake of Amanda's unexpected apology. Gloria approached him quietly. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," Marcus replied after a long pause. "I think we're finally starting to get somewhere." The next morning, Pinehurst woke to headlines across local and national media. Former Officer Amanda Brookes issues public apology. The forum had been streamed online, and Amanda's unexpected appearance dominated conversations across the town. Some viewed her apology as genuine. Others saw it as a calculated attempt to salvage her reputation. For Marcus, the day began like any other. Coffee in hand, paperwork spread across his desk at the community center. But the air felt different. Amanda's apology had stirred something deep within the community, and it wasn't just debate, it was possibility. Mid-morning, Marcus received a call from Cynthia Bell. Her tone was urgent. "Marcus, we need to talk," she said. "Can you meet me at the center?" Within the hour, Cynthia arrived carrying a stack of documents and a laptop. She set them on the desk, her expression serious. "I've been contacted by the state attorney's office," she began. "They're opening an inquiry into the Pinehurst Police Department, and they want you to testify." Marcus's brow furrowed. "Testify? About what?" "Everything," Cynthia said. "Your experiences, the trial, what happened with Amanda, everything you've seen and endured. They're building a case for systemic reform, and your voice could make a difference." The weight of her words settled over Marcus. He had fought so hard to bring change to Pinehurst, but the idea of stepping onto a larger stage was daunting. "I don't know, Cynthia," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair. "It's one thing to fight for my community, but this is bigger than anything I've ever faced." Cynthia leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "Exactly, and that's why you have to do it." This isn't just about Pinehurst anymore. It's about every town like it. You've already shown what courage looks like. Now you have the chance to make that impact even greater." As Marcus considered her words, the door to the community center opened, and Amanda walked in. The room fell silent as Cynthia turned to look at her, her expression immediately guarded. "I need a moment with Marcus," Amanda said quietly, her tone hesitant. Cynthia glanced at Marcus, who nodded. She stepped out, leaving the two alone. Amanda stood awkwardly near the door, her gaze darting around the room. "This is nice place," she said finally. "Thanks," Marcus replied, his tone neutral. Amanda took a deep breath, then stepped closer. "I know I've said this already, but I need you to understand how sorry I am. For everything. I can't change what I did, but I want to help fix what I broke." Marcus studied her, his expression unreadable. "What does that look like to you?" "I don't know yet," Amanda admitted. "But I'm here to listen, to learn. And if there's anything I can do to help, I'll do it." For a long moment, Marcus said nothing. Then he stood, crossing his arms as he faced her. "Change isn't about words, Amanda. It's about actions. If you're serious, you need to show it. Not to me, but to this community." Amanda nodded, her resolve hardening. "I will." The conversation stayed with Marcus long after Amanda left. Her sincerity seemed real, but trust was something she'd have to earn, not expect. Later that evening, Marcus met with Gloria and other community leaders to discuss the state inquiry. As they debated the next steps, Marcus's phone buzzed. It was an alert from a local news outlet. "Breaking. Pinehurst Police Chief announces resignation amid growing scrutiny." The room fell silent as Marcus read the headline aloud. Gloria leaned back in her chair, a smile breaking across her face. "That's the power of accountability," she said. But the victory was short-lived. The next alert on Marcus's phone sent a chill through the room. Anonymous threats made against Marcus Hale, following community forum. The words felt like a punch to the gut. Marcus stared at the screen, the weight of the threat sinking in. Gloria was the first to speak. "We're not going to let them scare us," she said firmly. Marcus nodded, but the threat was a stark reminder of the risks he faced. His fight for justice had made him a target, and the resistance to change was growing more desperate. The next few days were tense. Police presence around the community center increased, and Marcus was advised to avoid public appearances. Despite the precautions, he refused to be silenced. When the day came for Marcus to testify before the state inquiry, the courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the aisles, and supporters gathered outside chanting his name. As Marcus took the stand, he felt the weight of countless eyes on him, but he also felt the strength of his community behind him. He spoke with conviction, recounting his experiences with the Pinehurst Police Department, the trial, and the systemic issues that had plagued the town for generations. His testimony was raw and unflinching, a powerful indictment of the injustices he had faced and witnessed. When he finished, the room was silent. Then, one by one, people began to applaud, their voices swelling into a standing ovation. As Marcus stepped down from the stand, he felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. This was his purpose, to use his voice, his experiences, and his resilience to create lasting change. Back in Pinehurst, Amanda watched the live broadcast of Marcus's testimony from her apartment. Tears streamed down her face as she listened, the weight of her own actions crashing over her like a wave. For the first time, she allowed herself to hope, not just for redemption, but for a better future for the town she had once tried to control. This story reminds us that the fight for justice and equality begins with courage and resilience. Just as Marcus Hale found the strength to stand against a broken system, each of us can become a voice for meaningful change. Ask yourself, what can I do to support equity in my community? How can I educate myself and others about issues of social justice? Take action. Attend community meetings, peaceful protests, or local initiatives. Amplify marginalized voices and support organizations that promote justice and equality. Speak out against injustices and advocate for transparency and accountability in all areas of society. Share the story. If this story inspired you, share it with friends, family, or on your social media. Stories have the power to connect, educate, and mobilize. Together, we can create a world that is fairer and more inclusive for everyone.